Panama, the early morning hours of April 1990. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division undertake the largest combat jump since the Second World War. While the fighting would be costly for these troops, many more Americans and Panamanians could have died had US Navy SEALs not cleared the way. The SEALs too suffered high casualties, greater than that of virtually any other American unit. This was to be expected, however, for they are the Navy's frontline troops. The Navy SEALs are the first to hit the beaches. Life in the American Navy before World War II was in many ways a casual existence. The problems of Europe seemed far away, and the Atlantic Fleet didn't often stray from its home base in Norfolk, Virginia. The Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, was even more relaxed. It was easy duty. Although war was raging in Europe, the fighting seemed very remote and non-threatening. The one potential problem was the Japanese, and the only way they could attack the American fleet was from the air. But as everyone knew at the time, carrier aircraft couldn't possibly strike thousands of miles away from their home base. This false sense of security was bolstered by the fact that many Americans believed any country in the Far East was simply incapable of challenging the mighty dominance of the United States. On December the 7th, 1941, they were proved wrong. In one action, America was forced into the war. Germany quickly allied itself with the Japanese. 3 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. This was the opportunity the British had been praying for. Winston Churchill knew only too well that the British were in an increasingly desperate situation as 1941 drew to a close. Too few men, too few ships, and hardly enough food. With America forced into action, Churchill was convinced that its contribution would lead to ultimate victory for the Allies. The Japanese moved quickly to conquer American possessions in the Pacific. The Philippines fell, along with Wake Island and Guam. The Navy had few ways of striking back. At best, they could only stem the enemy's advance across the Pacific. At the Battle of Midway, the stepping stone to Hawaii, both sides were blooded. However, the Japanese lost more carriers than the Americans. The invasion of Hawaii and the American West Coast may have been averted, but the Japanese still controlled most of the Pacific. Even though ships and planes were being built at a record pace and millions of men were being trained, America needed time. President Roosevelt realized it would take months before American forces could be thrown into battle. The British, as well as the Americans, were just not ready to fight on two major fronts at the same time. The decision was made to take on the Germans first. The US would continue to deploy the Navy and the Marine Corps to fight a holding action in the Pacific. The one remaining piece of strategy was to decide how and where to attack the Germans. By the summer of 1942, the German hold on continental Europe was virtually complete. The Soviet Union had been invaded, and the Russians were begging for the Western Allies to take action. The British, however, were still reeling from their defeat in France, and the Americans were still too unprepared to face the Germans head-on. The Allies would have to begin cautiously. Operation Torch was conceived. the Allied invasion of German-dominated North Africa. The first American incursion on the Moroccan coast would be critical for a number of reasons. If large numbers of Americans were killed before landing, not only would it delay implementation of Allied strategy and probably prolong the war, but perhaps more importantly, the impact on morale at home would be devastating. Success was paramount. But before Allied troops could mount an assault on even lightly defended beaches, the way would have to be cleared for them. The Americans turned to a small group of Navy salvage experts who had been hard at work around Pearl Harbor ever since the devastating Japanese attack. The members of the specially formed unit, which became known as a UDT, or Underwater Demolition Team, were assigned to blow up a large cable and boom serving as a barrier across the harbor near Casablanca. On November the 11th, 1942, the UDT team successfully destroyed the boom and cleared the way for General George Patton's army to come ashore, leading America into the war. These men of the 1st Combat Demolition Unit were the origin of today's Navy SEALs. The success of this important mission soon resulted in the creation of additional teams. But that would be too late for the Marines about to land on the Japanese-held Tarawa Atoll in the Pacific. The Leathernecks landing craft were caught on an offshore reef. Desperately, the heavily laden Marines charged forward. But bravery alone couldn't overcome the water's depth. Hundreds drowned before they even reached the shore. The Japanese relentlessly directed intense gunfire into the ranks of the helpless men. This disaster brought home to strategists at the War Department the importance of having specialized teams trained to conduct reconnaissance of beachheads and to eliminate obstacles that could hinder the progress of assault troops. The Navy would have to move fast if these special forces were going to have a positive impact on the war effort. Plans were already well underway for the invasion of the European mainland. Navy leaders ordered the creation of more naval demolition units in May 1943. This command was made up of eager volunteers from throughout the service, predominantly Navy CB engineers and demolitions experts. These men were expected to help in the invasion of Sicily, where it was feared another incident like the disaster at Tarawa would be repeated. On July the 10th, 1943, Allied troops stormed ashore on Sicily's beaches. Opposition was heavy. The demolition experts were supposed to be clearing obstacles from the beaches. But German aircraft and artillery were not only causing high casualties, but were sinking Allied landing craft in large numbers. The men of the demolition units found themselves clearing these away before they could go ashore to destroy German gun emplacements. Graphic proof that even a carefully planned mission could, and did, change unexpectedly during battle. Back in the United States, the limited experience of these newly blooded veterans was put to good use when they became part of a formal school established to provide more specialized training. Ultimately, they would become known as CDUS, an acronym for Combat Demolition Units. An important part of their training was simple physical endurance. A 6-day so-called motivation week was established, during which the men were driven to their physical and emotional limits. The points of the exercise was to weed out all but those whose sense of motivation enabled them to overcome pain, exhaustion, and stress. For the SEALs, this tradition survives to this day as Hell Week. The justification for this intense, even brutal experience was that these men would be expected to perform their missions under far more difficult conditions. Heavy emphasis was placed on beach clearing techniques. Ironically, in these early days, underwater swimming skills were not considered particularly important. The modern aqualung was still under development. It was simply expected that the men could swim a few hundred yards. Successful action on the beaches was the paramount objective. Therefore, training focused on the ability to handle small boats, reach shore, and efficiently eliminate obstacles on and around the beaches. The training was hazardous, and there were a number of casualties during the process. But everyone knew the men would be facing far worse when it came time to confront the Germans. On graduation from the course, the men were formed into six-man teams. Most were deployed to England to await the final push into Western Europe. The eventual invasion of Normandy was the largest amphibious landing ever attempted. The plan was to have 500,000 men come ashore in a short period of time and over a relatively small stretch of coastline. General Eisenhower knew the first few hours of the assault were the most critical. If the landings didn't go smoothly, it might be months or even longer before another invasion could be mounted. And Hitler was not idly waiting for the Americans and British to attack. German naval units were still capable of harassing the Allies and threatening the invasion fleet. German scientists were making rapid progress in designing and developing their rockets and jet fighters. The landings had to work. When the time came for Allied forces to cross the English Channel to the beaches of France, the combat demolition units were among the first to face the Germans. Their primary task was to clear the landing areas so the heavy transport ships could get close to shore. Once the initial beach area was secured, the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall had to be breached. The Germans had used their vast resources of slave labor to build vast steel and reinforced concrete barriers. German divers were as determined as the Americans and British to defeat their enemy. Up to the moment of the invasion, they worked to anchor mines and anti-tank barriers to the sea floor. The most fearsome of these insidious devices was the Belgian Gate, a mobile construction of steel girders welded together with explosive mines attached. Strong enough to stop a tank or landing craft, the design allowed German guns to be fired through gaps in the structure. The elimination of these barriers was precisely the type of role envisioned for the CDUS when they were created. The demolition teams moved to destroy the barriers and obstacles by using a specially developed plastic explosives package, created by Lieutenant Carl Hagensen. The so-called Hagensen pack and its later variations are still standard equipment for the SEALs. They fulfilled their mission. The initial assault was as deadly as planners had feared. The Germans were disciplined and efficient. They directed rapid-firing artillery down at the beaches and raked the incoming troops with machine gun fire. It was a time of bravery and bloodshed. The Germans knew if they didn't defeat the Allies now, they could never win the war. The 550 men of the demolition units suffered over 50% casualties. Whole teams were wiped out. But eventually, the infantry was able to move off the beaches and drive inland. The successful Normandy invasion behind them, the teams now turned their attention to the war in the Pacific theater, where they were referred to as UDTs, or Underwater Demolition Teams, a designation that would last until the SEAL teams were created in 1962. An island-hopping campaign was making slow but gradual progress against the entrenched Japanese. Here, UDT teams faced conditions far different from those at Normandy. The islands were often surrounded by large coral reefs that proved as difficult to overcome as the Belgian gates on the beaches of France. Typically, the UDTs conducted reconnaissance of Japanese-held beaches before the landing by the Marines. techniques were developed to drop the UDTs off on the beaches from fast boats and pick them up later, all the time moving at full speed. During this time, the men's combat kit was simplified to where they were often armed with no more than a combat knife. They learned to swim with face masks and developed waterproof watches, compasses and radios. These would prove crucial in clearing pathways for the landing craft to negotiate the jagged coral reefs. In addition to acting as pathfinders, the UDTs were also responsible for destroying obstacles and fortifications on the beaches. The teams grew in size. The standard team was now made up of 100 men and 13 officers. By war's end, there were more than 3,500 UDTs. As the end of the war neared, it would be the men of the UDTs who would be the first American combat troops to set foot on Japan proper, and true to what was now tradition, leave a calling card for the approaching occupation troops. Welcome, Marines. The future for the UDTs was being formulated even before the war officially ended. The teams had already begun working with the maritime unit of the Office of Strategic Services, the super-secret predecessor to the CIA, and this would continue. OSS men were the best of the best. They were recruited from all branches of the military and also included civilians. These men were free of many of the restrictions facing a conventional military unit. Their directive was espionage and sabotage. Their techniques were easily and quickly adopted by the UDTs, with whom they trained and sometimes conducted joint missions. The OSS introduced the Navymen to the efficient use of swim fins and new but still primitive and dangerous underwater breathing devices. These unorthodox men, with their unusual equipment, would become known as frogmen. Cooperation between the OSS and the UDTs was a practical training ground for the kinds of missions SEAL teams would later undertake in places like Southeast Asia. But in 1945, another war seemed a virtual impossibility, and most of the UDT men were demobilized. Equipment was put into storage, and only a handful of men remained on call. But the missions they did undertake opened a new world to the frogmen. In 1946, UDT teams were part of Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests in the Pacific. The Navy wanted to see what effect the blast would have on ships at sea. The UDT men were part of the survey teams at Bikini Atoll where the bombs exploded. The Navy, along with the UDTs, experienced firsthand the devastating effect of the bomb. It appeared that the day of the individual swimmer, armed only with a knife or pistol, was at an end. On June the 25th, 1950, communist North Korean troops invaded South Korea, and America was engaged in yet another war. UDTs stationed in Japan were immediately dispatched to Korea, where undermanned US forces were struggling to slow the communist advance. The SEALs were pressed into action almost immediately, conducting reconnaissance along the coast and performing numerous acts of sabotage. Lieutenant George Atchison, a member of UDT Team 3, had the unfortunate distinction of being the first American naval casualty of the war when he was wounded in one of these early raids. As the war dragged on, the UDT teams found their skill at infiltration led to being engaged in frequent firefights. Again and again, they proved that UDTs were much more than demolition experts. They were also skilled fighters. The success of the UDTs in Korea led to the Navy formally acknowledging the ability of the teams to conduct a wide range of missions, from the traditional clearing of beaches to conducting guerrilla and intelligence operations, skills that would all too soon be needed again. In 1958, the Chinese Communists began shelling nationalist Chinese positions on the islands of Quemoy and Matsu in the South China Sea. The American 7th Fleet was deployed to the area, and UDT teams were once again dispatched on reconnaissance missions. The strategy of deterrence worked in China. Both sides glared at each other, but full-scale war was averted. The early 60s was a time of optimism with an edge. The election of John F. Kennedy had brought a dynamic sense of change. The world seemed more sophisticated. It was a time of James Bond, and the unconventional was suddenly in fashion. President Kennedy was drawn to the role that special forces could play, and he supported them.
His victory statement.
Americans, I say that the next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s.
The Navy moved to create special operation teams to be attached to the UDTs. By 1962, these special teams were formally organized into their own command, and the SEALs were born. Meanwhile, other UDTs were facing a different challenge. They were among the first men involved in the space program. Before astronauts could be hurled into space, volunteers from the UDTs spent long hours floating underwater to test man's ability to endure weightlessness. Because of the UDT tradition of harsh training, they were also used in experiments to determine how much stress the human mind and body could tolerate. Given their superb level of fitness, the men of the UDTs helped establish the standards which the astronaut corps would have to strive to attain. When Americans finally did make it into space, the UDT teams were still part of the program. In the days before the shuttle, spacecraft had to parachute to a soft landing at sea, a risky maneuver at best. SEALs were the men who jumped into the ocean to recover both capsule and astronaut. Disaster was narrowly averted in the 1961 flight of Mercury 4, when astronaut Gus Grissom's cabin door mysteriously opened and the one-man craft filled with water. The UDT teams acted quickly, but the spacecraft was lost, and Grissom nearly drowned. At the same time, American involvement in Vietnam was growing. Protecting the long coastline of Vietnam and the labyrinth of the Mekong River Delta was a tailor-made assignment for the SEALs. The first two-man team was deployed in 1962. SEAL operations in Vietnam were far more secretive than those of the Army. Their mission, particularly in the Viet Cong-infested Delta region, was simple: harass the enemy and deny him sanctuary. The SEALs became the guerrilla in a guerrilla war. Using stealth and cunning, they perfected the art of hunting down and ambushing the enemy. This was killing on a personal level. The SEALs never numbered more than a few hundred. A typical operation usually included just a handful of men on a patrol boat, or a squad dropped by helicopter deep in the mangrove swamps. There they waited for Charlie to move into range. Involvement in Vietnam grew from a relatively low-level conflict in the early 60s, with just a handful of Americans involved, to over 500,000 American soldiers and sailors by the end of the decade. The ground fighting spread to Cambodia and Laos. In the end, air raids reached to North Vietnam, where B-52s carpet-bombed parts of Hanoi and Haiphong. This was virtually full-scale conventional warfare. But in spite of the immense amount of hardware and manpower, the communists were never defeated. Along the way, there were a few victories, though, such as in the Mekong Delta, where the SEALs had quietly kept up relentless pressure against the Viet Cong. The war they fought was on the borderline of moving from unconventional to an exercise in sheer terror. Often using silencers, the strategy of ambushing the Viet Cong to take prisoners became synonymous with a campaign of assassination and kidnapping. This was the time of the CIA-sponsored Phoenix campaign, which deliberately targeted the Viet Cong for killing. It was open to abuse, and some say it was an operation that got out of control. The SEALs' relationship with Phoenix will never be fully known, as the SEALs tended to operate virtually on their own. Their tactics might be questioned in hindsight, but the reality was that the SEALs outsmarted the Viet Cong at their own game.
If you really want some exciting work, come to SEAL Team, and you'll be involved in it. We're more or less of an unsung soldier in a lot of respects because they can't write up a lot of the things we do, but I say that within yourself you'll know, you'll have this personal pride that, no, you was there and you did the job. After the war, they'll probably write about it. But if you're in here for just getting the Bronze Star and your name on the front page, no, you won't, because they don't put our name on the front page. Well, you'll know within yourself, you'll know what your buddies have done, you'll know our record, and you'll know what a great unit we are. You'll be there.
We are basically an intelligence gathering unit. We gather every bit of information that's possible, whether it be a small piece of paper with some Vietnamese writing on it, or trails, boat traffic, anything that might be of real significant value to your intelligence officer when you get back.
Every man's got to have the physical strength to get through the mission and the mental strength not to waver when the going gets rough. And it gets pretty rough pretty regularly.
You never say anything on patrol. From the time you leave that boat or the helicopter or however you're getting inserted to the time you get back, you don't even open your mouth. We teach them hand and arm signals in cadre training. It doesn't make any difference what type of signal you do use as long as everybody knows it.
An intelligence officer can do so much more with little facts than you have any idea of. If he can find out, for instance, that there is large amounts of rice being moved down a river, then he knows there are either people down there needing food or that there will be people down there soon. When he adds this to other bits of information he's found out, well, a pattern of enemy activity begins to develop.
One of the most unusual missions in which the SEALs were rumored to be involved was the training of dolphins to attack enemy frogmen. Reportedly, the dolphins had large syringes attached to their heads and were taught to ram any Viet Cong entering the waters surrounding the large American supply base at Cam Ranh Bay. Dolphins by nature attack sharks in a similar way. Lethal doses of CO2 gas were injected into unsuspecting swimmers. Of all the folklore surrounding the SEALs in Vietnam, this remains the most difficult to verify or dismiss. The base at Cam Ranh Bay, however, was never attacked from the sea. The majority of American troops and sailors were withdrawn in 1973, and Vietnam fell to the Communists in 1975. The SEALs were among the highest decorated units for their size in the war. SEALs were awarded 2 Navy Crosses, 42 Silver Stars, 402 Bronze Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, 352 Commendation Medals, 3 Presidential Unit Citations, and 3 Medals of Honor. The SEALs were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1971. A number of the teams were demobilized as America entered a period of profound self-doubt. The military was confronted with concerns about drug abuse and racial tensions. There were also serious questions about America's ability to recover from the trauma of Southeast Asia. However, the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought a renewed sense of purpose to all the armed services. The president seemed willing to use American power. He referred to the Soviets as the evil empire. The Russians were seen as being on the move all over the world, from Afghanistan to Central America. It was on the small Caribbean island of Grenada that President Reagan drew a line in the sand. America was about to go to war again. There were around 1,000 Americans on the island, including some 700 medical students. The administration was concerned they might be taken as hostages. Although this was cited as the official reason for the invasion, there is little doubt that the overriding purpose was to demonstrate to left-wing dictators around the world that this was a new era in which the United States was willing to directly confront communism. The invasion, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury, involved 6,500 U.S. forces, including Rangers, parts of the 82nd Airborne, the Marines, SEALs, and the Delta Force. The SEALs, along with Delta Force, were given some of the most critical tasks in the operation. These included securing the airfield, attacking the island prison to free senior government officials, and rescuing the Governor-General, Sir Paul Scoon. In addition to providing reconnaissance for a parachute and beach landing, they were to attack and secure Radio Grenada. While the Grenadan operation was filled with individual acts of cunning and heroism, several bureaucratic blunders marred the campaign. This was the first large-scale offensive military operation since Vietnam. The military had to relearn the routines of war. For example, operational security meant that no group trained with another. There were therefore no common communication systems between the different units, and there was no opportunity to rehearse the invasion plans. The result was a military fiasco. A Delta Force team landed at the airfield at Point Salines on schedule, but was spotted and attacked. In 4 hours of fighting, 6 men from the 35-strong unit were killed and 16 wounded. 1 SEAL team was stopped before it managed to attack the radio station. When another SEAL team approached the island, it was dropped from the aircraft using the LAPS method, low-altitude parachute extraction system, whereby men and dinghy are pulled out of the cargo hold into the sea. The first 4-man team was knocked unconscious on impact and drowned. The second team landed safely, but was forced to turn off their engine after a fishing boat came too close. The engine flooded, and they were swept out to sea. They were rescued 11 hours later by a Navy helicopter. The SEAL team rescuing Sir Paul Scoon was pinned down, and the 2 Marine helicopters called in to help were shot down. The SEALs were stranded until the island had been captured and the Grenada forces surrendered. The Delta Force, targeted at the prison, were due to attack in the dark using 9 Black Hawk helicopters piloted by men from Task Force 160, the Night Stalkers. Task Force 160 was also equipped with Hughes 500 helicopters, one of which was shot down. The attack started 5 hours late and took place in broad daylight. As a result, several of the helicopters were shot down and the attack abandoned. Although the invading force faced 784 Cubans, of which 50 had received serious military training, and 2,000 members of the Grenadan army, it took 48 hours before the last of the students was rescued. The invasion, which should have been executed efficiently in a short period of time, particularly against a lightly equipped and poorly trained army, had in fact become a long, drawn-out battle which resulted in unnecessarily high casualties. The Grenada operation may well have marked a low point in the recent history of American Special Forces. Later operations were to be more successful, in part because of better training, but more importantly because a new command and control system was established to improve planning and liaison between units. In August 1984, for example, a Delta Force team helped in the storming of a hijacked aircraft in Curaçao. And in October 1985, SEALs captured the terrorists responsible for the hijacking of the cruise line Aquile Loro. Continuing President Reagan's aggressive foreign policy, George Bush authorized the U.S. invasion of Panama on December the 20th, 1989, in an operation codenamed Just Cause. 25,000 American troops were used in a night attack to confront 11,000 Panamanian defense forces and militia. 21 aircraft from all 5 squadrons in the Air Force's 1st Special Operations Wing at Hulbert Field and Eglin Air Force Base flew over 400 missions, logging 1,200 flying hours during the operation. The planes included AC-130 gunships, 3 MC-130E combat Talons, 5 MH-53 EJ Pave-Low helicopters, 2 HC-130 refueling tankers, and 4 MH-60D Pave Hawk helicopters. At 0100 HRs on the first day, a team of 20 SEALs advanced to Patia Airfield to disable any planes that General Manuel Noriega might use for an escape. Instead of the light defense they expected, the SEALs came under heavy fire, and 4 men were killed, and at least 6 more wounded. A second unit successfully disabled boats in Panama Harbor that might also have been used by Noriega. Immediately after the SEALs launched their attack, 1,000 Rangers parachuted into Panama's main international airport. They were followed by more Rangers and 2,000 members of the 82nd Airborne. In recent years, the biggest challenge for Special Operations Forces came in Desert Storm. Initially, General Norman Schwarzkopf was reluctant to use the Green Berets, SEALs, or Air Force's elite units. The British, who were strong proponents of special units, said they would deploy them unilaterally. The American command finally approved their deployment, and they went on to play a key role in the war. Some 5,000 Special Operations personnel participated as part of the more than 500,000 American forces sent to the Gulf. 14 of them died when an AC-130 gunship was shot down in the early morning battle to capture the Saudi Arabian city of Kafji. The SEALs carried out 270 missions during the war, without suffering a single casualty. SEALs, joining with other special forces, patrolled behind Iraqi lines, searching for Scud missiles. They provided intelligence on the location and movement of Iraqi forces, and participated in the rescue of downed pilots. The Vietnam and Gulf Wars may have offered prime examples of the classic use of special forces, but it is peacetime mission that is now taking priority. Once again, Special Forces troops from all the U.S. services are engaged in the Hearts and Minds campaigns, which have been a central strategy since their formation after World War II. In 1991, Special Operations Command employed some 2,000 Special Forces teams in 75 countries around the world. The ability of the SEALs to take on such arduous missions is based on their strenuous and intense training. The program, begun in World War II, became refined in the 60s, when the American involvement in Vietnam grew. The emphasis was on toughness. The single most important element is called BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL. The BUDS school conducts what many in the military community consider the most demanding military training course in the world. Maintaining the tradition begun in 1943 with Motivation or Hell Week, the SEAL School is located near San Diego, California. Going through the SEAL course means spending 26 weeks undergoing a variety of exercises. The Navy selects the best and the brightest volunteers from the regular Navy. These men are subjected to an exhaustive series of physical and mental tests to prove their fitness for service. The fundamental principle of the exercise is to prove to the would-be SEALs that they are capable of enduring greater emotional and physical stress than they think they're capable of. Once the first selection phase is complete, the men are sent to the BUDS school. They spend 15 grueling hours each day preparing to become SEALs. The day begins at dawn. At first, the training is elemental. Push-ups, sit-ups. Candidates run everywhere on the double. There is little time for relaxation, even at chow. The men spend hundreds of hours challenging what is considered to be one of the world's most daunting obstacle courses.
It's just that, well, I want UDT, and I can do all these things. And then you get a positive attitude about the training, and there's nothing they can do to make you quit. You can endure all the extra push-ups and the instructors hollering at you, and just take it with a grain of salt and just say, well, that's part of the program. Always think ahead. Well, in another hour, this problem's going to be over, and I'll be back in the barracks in a hot shower and a hot...
You have to want this type duty in order to survive this training. Some people, I suppose, want to prove something to themselves. Some people, maybe they want to prove something to somebody else.
I think it's a psychological aspect, the hardship while you're doing all this. In other words, you think about things a little bit differently. You start realizing that probably one of the greatest things you ever had was just sitting in a warm room with a cup of coffee. You just don't know how much you can appreciate something like that. It prepares you well for when you go in combat. You learn that a little rain's not going to hurt you, a little mud's not going to hurt you. You don't like it, but you learn that you can live with it.
There's one point in every part of the day that you wonder why you're here, what you're doing, but that's the difference between you and the guy that quit, is that you didn't quit.
I had one guy that came into sick bay and just said, I can't keep up with the runs, and he had a fractured fibula. He had a stress fracture that went to completion, and he just tried to gut it out as long as he could, but he was running on a broken leg.
We had a guy last Friday. We had a really hard day. Fridays are pretty bad. And he couldn't make the run. It was his first day, and we carried him for about a mile. So he made the run no matter what, even if we have to pick him up and take him all the way down the beach.
More than 50% of the candidates ring the bell or quit before the course is finished. The training teaches the men practical techniques and teamwork, how to work together. They carry telephone poles and rafts to further develop the sense of cooperation and reliance on each other.
Frog family is the best family that ever came over across the sea. There's a highland frog and a lowland frog, a Rotterdam. The temperature in the shade is 193. There isn't any water and there isn't any grass. All there is cactus and it sticks you in the glorious, glorious. 1 keg of beer for the 4 of us, singing glory be to God that there are no more of us. The Lord, one of us could drink it all alone, stand near. Hoo-yah! Hoo-yah!
At the end of the first phase of training, the candidates can run 4 miles in 32 minutes and swim 2 miles in an hour and a half.
People win.
It's basically a confidence building evolution, and they at early point of training are bound hand and feet eventually, and they have progressive drills that build to that so that they can see that they can do quite a bit in the water if they just think their way through the problem and relax.
Well, you want to quit? No. Then why are you yelling stop?
The start of training graduates from here. We place students in a very scientifically designed, stressful situation from day one to day end.
The candidates must still endure Hell Week, 6 days of intense training designed to bring out the best in a man by nearly breaking him. The candidate will either gain confidence or wash out of the program. If the candidate has survived all of this, he begins learning the essential skills necessary to becoming a SEAL.
Our type of training now, of course, it includes diving and demolition work and parachuting and very extensive weapon training and tactics training, so our people are well qualified, or maybe even the most qualified troop there is.
You've got to want it inside of here, gentlemen. I told you that.
we throw things at you rather fast. You've got to react immediately. Because later on, if you don't react immediately, you will be a casualty. And you're doing us no good. We have to put you in an old pine box because you didn't use your noodle. You'll be exposed to pain and punishment and other little devices that we'll think of for one reason and one reason only. To make you the type of person we need to get the job done, no matter what the job is.
In UDT training, they very definitely push you to your limits. In fact, beyond what you thought was your limit. It's an eye-opener. It was an eye-opener for me, and I'm sure it was for most people.
What training does for us is it gives us a stamina. Teaches us to know ourselves. To know that we could, if we had to, run for 3 hours, 18 miles. Know we could move across 600 meters of mud on our stomachs and be ready to fight when we get there.
It's not a breeze. I think it's more of a mental problem than it is physical. I mean, if it's a normal, average, athletic type person that has nothing physically wrong with him, then it's all up to him. If he wants UDT bad enough, he can endure the runs. They don't punish you to where you can't walk again, or you don't have to swim so far that you're going to cramp up and drown.
Get up. Straighten your legs, Adams. Lock your knees.
Land warfare skills and basic underwater demolition techniques are acquired. They learn how to conduct reconnaissance missions and become adept at working with map and compass.
Move. Come on, go. Communicate, people. It'll keep you alive.
Clandestine is the name of the game. It's not a chest-beating thing where you walk down the street and say, you know, I'm a SEAL or I'm a SEAL trainee. It's kind of a quiet professionalism.
These sailors will have to operate like soldiers on real missions and are given intense firearms training. The live fire exercise tests their ability to remain cool-headed in the confusing conditions of battle. The candidates become familiar with helicopter assaults and maneuvering with small boats. While the technical training goes on, the men still maintain fitness and learn to survive at sea. In the end, they must be able to swim 5 miles in open ocean. In the final phase of SEAL training, the candidates receive advanced training with aqualung and scuba gear.
Okay, this morning, gentlemen, we're going to take up what was known in the teams as an Emerson scuba rig. This means that it is a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. This rig is used any type of clandestine or sneak attack operations. It is desirable for this use because of the fact that there are no bubbles coming out of this rig when it is submerged. And we can have you step up here, sir. We'll slip you into it.
The buddy system is taught, where the man next to you may save your life. The intensive underwater training prepares the men for being able to function and fight in virtually any condition, from jumping out of helicopters to swimming out of submarines. Training involves far more than just physical ability. The SEALs are expected to be intellectually disciplined. Long hours are spent in the classroom. These men are expected to think on their own while on operations. The Navy has learned that decisions come hard and fast on the battlefield and landing beaches. These men are expected to be survivors. Completion of the SEAL school is a proud moment for men who make it through the course. But training continues after graduation.
Let them sing. Let the black shoes sing. From the east to the west, Navy SEALs are the best. Where the hell are you going, boy?
I don't want a guy who's a Rambo who spent most of his younger life watching himself in the mirror and pumping pig iron and rubbing himself down with Russian oil, because chances are he hasn't developed the internalization processes that lend themselves well to becoming mentally tough, which is what we try to get out of the kids.
Move, come on!
All SEALs receive airborne training with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division.
Stand in the door. What are you? Close it up tight. Close it up tight. Go. Get up and out. Get up and out. Get up and out. Get up and out.
When you put that chute on, your stomach starts getting hard. Your first jump especially. And they say hook up, check static line, check your equipment. The word comes to stand on the door, and I was scared.
So once you leave the door and you're out in the air, then it's the greatest thing in the world, because you know you've done it, you know that you didn't have to be pushed out the door, you did this thing on your own. You're still apprehensive every jump, because those thoughts always run through my mind. What am I doing up in this airplane? Why do I want to jump out of this airplane when I know it's going to land? But then once it's time to hook up and go, then it's just, hell, I love it.
As you approach the ground, now there's a man in a bullhorn saying, take a prepare-to-land attitude. Grab your risers, take a slip into the wind so you're trying to stand still. He says, now bend your knees, point your toes, chin up, eyes on the horizon. After your first one, you're ready to jump the next 4.
The modern SEALs are a relatively small unit. The force is estimated to number around 3,000 men. But they are a crucial element of America's military strategy. Along with other members of the U.S. Special Operations Command, such as the Army's Green Berets and the Delta Hostage Rescue Unit, the SEALs are expected to be able to deploy virtually anywhere in the world, often on very short notice. Their ongoing exercises prepare them for operating from the Arctic to the equator. In the end, the SEALs' mission still remains similar to that of the original UDTs of World War II. Infiltrate into the midst of hostile forces, clear the way for larger armed units, and kill the enemy. A lethal mission they have performed with dedication and skill for half a century.
4 years ago, 6 runnings of the race, she wins it twice. Sharp Boleyn stays on gallantly for David O'Mara.
Well, I've got him now. I think he might just be getting his breath back. The tremendous performance that. Let me come this side if I can. Superb. Well ridden, David.
Oh, look at the size of him. He's only about